Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Maria Economou. I'm a lecturer in museum studies and I have a joint post at the University of Glasgow. I'm based at the Hunterian, so we have the lovely offices 2 floors up, the ones with a nice view. And the other half of my job, I'm at the HATII, which stands for the Humanities Advanced Technology and Information Institute, which is a bit of a mouthful, based at the College of Arts at the School of Humanities. It's really nice to see a lot of new faces and some familiar ones, a mixture here today. We had a very busy, very fruitful day from the beginning, quite early on, with the symposium on evaluating digital cultural resources, and where we had a really international group of people from Canada to Switzerland, Sweden, the US, the Netherlands, together with people from Glasgow and the rest of Scotland, discussing some of the particularities of Glasgow's cultural scene and the Kelvin Hall, but also what are some of the common issues that are of international common concern among cultural heritage institutions. It's a great pleasure to complement this with a public talk. We thought we should really grab Mark ONeill before he retires. It's really nice for me because I was working at the university when I first started my academic career back in 1997, just after I had finished my PhD in Oxford. And Mark, then at the Kelvingrove Museum, was one of the first cultural institutions we worked with really closely. I won't say much more because it's Mary Pittock, Professor Mary Pittock, our Vice Principal of Special Projects, who was instrumental in developing what you see here. And she's also heavily involved in the phase 2, which is the excitement and the exciting possibilities about what will happen with the rest of the building, which is currently not open to the public. I'll just say, Mark said, with very good timing and his vast experience, he's going to talk for about 40 minutes. He's very aware he's the only thing between you and Prosecco and wine and nibbles. So Mari will say a few words about Mark, and then we'll take some questions, and then we'll move on the discussion, I think, outside over some wine. So I'll pass on to Mari.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much for asking me here to introduce Mark ONeill. And it is not just a pleasure, it's also a privilege to introduce Mark to talk about what a museum's for, because Mark ONeill has possibly unequalled understanding of the ability of museums to find new audiences and to become places of shared experience with both equality of access and well-being prized. He's worked in this city for just over 30 years, from when he was first employed by a local trust to establish a museum in Springburn, to becoming Keeper of Social History and originating the concept for the St Mungo Museum of Religious Life and Art, which remains the only interfaith museum in the UK. He led the team which refurbished the People's Palace in the mid-late 1990s, and also led on the Heritage Lottery funding, which sounds pretty terrifying, and as we get closer to possibly thinking about that in other contexts, sounds even more terrifying. Led the Heritage Lottery funding £30 million redisplay of Kelvingrove Art Gallery Museum, which was a huge job, but which, of course, initially created a giant boost for Kelvingrove's visitor numbers, which reached, I think, the 14th most visited museum in the world, with 3.2 million visits in its first year after reopening in 2006. Mark was head of museums from 1998 to 2005, then head of arts and museums, and then from 2010, director of policy at Glasgow Life. And I think Mark has a magic touch for finding what museums are for. I think the statistic that stands out for me, and of course the visitor numbers remain very high, is that in the first year of the Riverside, after it opened, 25% of visitors had, so it seems, never been to a museum before. And the accessibility of that experience and what it did for people who had been excluded or felt excluded from that degree of cultural access was really important, and it's a great achievement of Mark's and a great legacy. And also Mark's been very engaged with the development of Kelvin Hall 1 here and the preparation of the ground for Kelvin Hall 2, and I owe to him and his in many ways, his very calm advice and steering the research concordat which we've managed to get between the University of Glasgow Life, the National Library of Scotland, and the National Gallery of Scotland, focusing for the future on a variety of topics, including audiences and audience development, Macintosh, contemporary art, and much more. And just this week, and that's another innovation of Mark's, which, being a fan of joint appointments, which Maria just mentioned she was, being a fan of joint appointments, I very much welcomed. Mark managed to get Glasgow Life to co-fund a research development officer post with the university to fund research opportunities across Glasgow Life and the University of Glasgow, based in Kelvin Hall. And I think that person, an offer has been made to a person this week, and we expect an appointment to be made imminently. So that's yet another immediate practical achievement of Mark. There couldn't be a better person to talk to us about what museums are for in the UK today than Mark ONeill. Let's welcome him as he should be welcomed.
Thank you very much. Somewhere between self-deprecation and false modesty, that felt a bit like an obituary. Anyway, thank you very much. Jade was saying to me earlier, just say thanks if people are nice to you. You'll get over it. So thank you. So yes, this question, we're really delighted doing presentations. I don't do that many, and it forces you to actually articulate what you think, or what you think. And answering this question, obviously, a preoccupation of my entire career, which stretches back all those years. And for some people, actually, it's almost too simple a question. You know, there's no question, it's obvious what they are. And for other people, it's almost impossible to answer, because now you can have a museum of virtually anything. But before I dive into my talk, I want to do 3 epigraphs, and I've already mislaid my water, so I'll start again. I know epigraphs are for publications, but I wanted to do these because there are themes that I'll pick up as I go through. This is from the Irish historian Leckie, and it's a quote from his 1876 book, the title of which you can see there. And he talks about the idea of moral progress and the expanding circle of sympathy, that you go from your family to include a wider and wider circle. Interestingly, to include not just humanity, or man as it was called then, but the whole of the animal kingdom, quite prescient. And the question, I suppose, is, can we sustain the ideal of progress in these disenchanted, post-truth, in fact almost apocalyptic times? My second epigraph is this recent intervention by the great Glaswegian museum director, questioning Britain's attitude to public history and the dangerous and regrettable focus on the sunny side. I'm sure we can share Neil MacGregor's regret that somebody in charge of a major museum in London didn't take this enlightened view in the past 20 years. But the real question underlying this, leaving this bitterness aside, is, can museums really contribute to a critical culture? And the final epigraph is the formal UNESCO, the International Council of Museums, definition of a museum. And as you can see, it sets out the nature of museums as being charitable and public service rather than commercial, open to all, carrying out a range of functions relating to heritage. And it does list the benefits of museums, education, study and enjoyment. But I mean, if you read it and you actually want to answer the questions, what are museums for? It's a bit circular. Museums doesn't really say any more than that museums carry out museum-y functions for people who like museum-y things. So I'll try to address the question under these headings. I'm going to look at the question historically in the beginning. Very broad brush, I hasten to say, with some leading experts in the period I'm talking about in the audience. But much of the confusion about discussions about what museums are for is that people confuse these different perspectives and say that one or other is the essential essence, or is the essence of museums. I'm going to look at why people set up museums, what they thought they were doing, why societies took on funding museums, and why museums have now become part of the institutional repertoire of all societies across the world. And I'll say a bit about visitors, as you would expect from what Murray said about my background. But I'd also like to look at the dark side of museums and how museums are being affected by the amazing transformations we are experiencing. And then I'm going to take the opportunity at the end for a rant about what I think the future of museums should be. So, the historical interlude. Museums initially developed as private study collections, a response to the millions of artifacts and natural history specimens which flooded into Europe, especially after the discovery, or by Europeans, of the Americas. The wonders that were being brought back didn't fit into previous philosophies, previous classifications. There are no giraffes in the Bible. Aristotle had never seen a kangaroo, and the role of universities was not to create new knowledge, it was to pass on the tradition. So these new artifacts that didn't fit in traditional categories were really confusing, and actually universities took hundreds of years to adapt. New institutions had to be created, so royal institutes, academies, museums and coffee shops were key institutions that developed, where people tried to understand the world of difference and to understand nature. So once people started making collections as a way of understanding the world, this created a new kind of death management problem. Death management is a term from death studies. If you are depressed of an evening, it's a good thing to have a look into. But if you're a wealthy person, prior to the 18th century, what you did with your property was you left it to your family, or if you were feeling pious or guilty, you left it to a charity or to the church. But if you had spent your life gathering a collection which represented your search for knowledge, what could you do with it? There was no guarantee that your heirs would do anything other than sell it on, cash in immediately, and your life's work could be sold off or dispersed. And so even if individual objects were preserved, the collection, the assembly, would be destroyed. So this autobiographical aspect of a museum collection would be gone, and the spirit of the search for knowledge that inspired it would also disappear. So for the collection to live on, a new kind of afterlife had to be found for what was private property, and this is where people look to the state. So when Sir Hans Sloane left his vast collection to the state to form Britain's first directly public funded museum, it led to the founding of the British Museum in 1753. There's loads of European examples and stories, but I'm just sticking to the UK for the moment. Despite the founding of the British Museum, the government still resisted attempts to create a national gallery, and Britain lost major collections as a result of this view that setting up galleries was not the business of the state. Eventually it gave in, again responding to pressure from an individual collector who, like Hans Sloane, was very well connected with government, very influential. And in 1824 it acceded to the wishes of John Julius Andrestein and purchased 18 paintings from his collection and his house to show them in. There were suggestions that it should be incorporated into the British Museum, but access to the British Museum was so difficult, people said that there would be no point in putting it there, nobody would ever see it. Unlike the Hunterian, which was much more accessible at the time. But here again you see the intentions of an individual founder wishing his collection to be preserved intact and to relate to some emerging idea of the public. So why did society and how did society respond? The great collections of the Enlightenment which emerged from these cabinets of curiosity reflected a belief in the importance of understanding the material world and the power of reason to penetrate nature's secrets. This is so obvious now that it's rarely stated, but museums are based on the belief in the value of knowledge, which again is possibly coming into question, and the power of understanding to liberate human beings. The liberating power of knowledge is fundamental to what we do. And underneath this is a great, almost utopian aspiration, the vision that humanity is at its best when it's searching for truth. There are other dimensions, though. For the National Gallery, for example, it wasn't long before the comparison between Andrewstein's house and the Louvre created a sense of discrepancy, and the idea that this did not reflect the status and dignity of Great Britain, and Great Britain, obviously at this time, was an important developing concept. So once museums start to be created, emulation, competition, and envy become important forces. And edifice envy is a big deal in all of this development. The shift from individual collectors to societal ambitions is also reflected in the discussions about the new building, the one in Trafalgar Square. And it was discussed in the House of Commons in 1832, quite soon after passage of the Great Reform Act, which had been a huge trauma, lots of riots and fear of social breakdown. And in those debates, the Tory MP and former Prime Minister Robert Peel, who had lost his prime ministership because of the Great Reform Act, said, "In the present times of political excitement, the exacerbation of angry and unsocial feelings might be much softened by the effects which the fine arts had ever produced on the minds of men. A National Gallery would not only contribute to the cultivation of the arts, but to the cementing of the bonds of union between the richest and poorest orders of the state, joined in mutual intercourse and understanding." A definition of what we would now call social cohesion, a bit more hierarchical perhaps than we would think now, but very much about creating a space where people from different classes could be together in harmony, and practically nothing to do with what Andrewstein wanted his collection to do. The other great movement, historical movement, which shaped museums was Romanticism. I mean, fine art had always been highly valued and had high prestige in most societies across the world. But during the Romantic period, it took on an almost sacred power. So, I mean, despite or perhaps because of secularization, many people came to believe in the power of art to transform life and see the artist as a hero of self-expression, almost shamanistic insight in an increasingly individualistic society. Another major, again, we're talking sweeping generalizations here, impact of Romanticism was the idea of the nation, which again, people often take for granted now, the nation as a natural unit, but actually it's a relatively recent invention based on what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities of people who had never met but felt that they belonged together, a sense generated and reinforced by modern media like newspapers, maps, and museums. That's the National Museum of Ireland there in the bottom, in case anybody's wondering. And this is still a potent force. This is the National Museum of Australia, opened in 2001. So nations are still using museums to define themselves, just as Scotland did in 1999. This one was exceptionally controversial to the extent that it cost the director her job because people felt that the space devoted to Aboriginal culture and history was too much compared to white Australia. And again, we could be interesting to discuss that if you want to. But for my purposes, telling national stories through museums is still a big facet across the world. Museums are also used to tell city stories. There's the literature on nationalism is huge compared to the formation of civic identities in the 19th century, which is a shame, I think, because cities can be more inclusive identities. But again, cities like New York on the bottom left, or Bilbao much more recently, use museums to assert the identity and significance of their cities, and this is still a potent force in the world. Murray referred to the Riverside Museum. Glasgow, still extremely poor city in lots of ways, spent £74 million on a museum to assert its identity in the world. Another societal impetus that drove the creation of museums was the belief that the knowledge in museums could be used to educate the masses of the people. At a time when people were acquiring more and more rights, so museums became instruments of democracy. And actually museums were in some ways ahead of the democratic rights that people got. So this photograph from the 1860s shows classes mixing, and actually it shows a upper class person instructing a fascinated working class person. So again, quite paternalistic, but the classes are mixing, and at a time long before working class men and women of any kind had the vote, they mingled and were exposed to these civic spaces in museums. The other impetus in the 19th century was what I've called healing the city. Along with parks and libraries, museums were often a response to the grim conditions of industrial cities, an attempt to create a utopian, clean space which healed some of the damage that was being done by these industrial forces. And I'm not talking about this in retrospect. This was made explicit at the time. This is a quote from a lecture given in 1891 by Councillor Robert Crawford, who chaired both the Public Health Committee and the Museum Committee. It was a lecture to the Ruskin Society, the Society of the Rose, and it was about the foundation of the People's Palace. And as you can see, I won't do PowerPoint karaoke, you can read. He makes an explicit link between public health and municipal art. Sorry, mutual benefit. I cut off a word at the end, I did. And actually, what's really interesting about this is a bit of a sideline, but there's a lot of epidemiological research recently, so not researching projects, but using big data. People who visit museums regularly, go to concerts or the cinema, live longer than people who don't. And those studies are controlled for age, gender, income, education, chronic illness, and there have been randomized controlled trials and statistical analysis which show that cultural attendance is a separate variable. If you stop going, you lose the health benefit. If you take it up again, you gain the health benefit. So it's an ephemeral benefit. It's like exercise. You have to keep it up. And it seems that cultural attendance is a cause, not an effect. It's not that healthier people go to culture more. It's people who go to culture more are healthier as a result. And I think in the next decade, cultural attendance will be accepted in the same way that exercise is accepted as a public good. But that's just a digressive rant. Back to the narrative. The other big development in the 19th century was the shift from the countryside to the city, and this created a huge sense of loss, nostalgia for the vanishing countryside. The vanishing countryside, a big romanticization of the rural way of life, which most people who left the countryside were glad to leave behind, especially women. But the first open-air museum was opened in Stockholm in 1891, Skansen, and since then a lot of museums, including museums in cities. There's a museum of the Romanian peasant in Bucharest, which basically says that the essence of the Romanian nation is the peasant. So in some ways, there can't be any Romanian peasants left now. So the essence of their nation is something that's in the past. This is a very similar huge social movement happened in the 1970s and 80s with the collapse of the very iron, steam and coal civilization which destroyed that rural way of life. And across the industrial world, people set up museums of industry, again romanticizing this past form, this past way of life in a way that, again, people at the time would possibly find peculiar. Museums are also used to celebrate the lives of heroes, and here you can see how the political orientation of museums is much more explicit and clear than we often pretend. So you have the top left is the Museum of Lenin, that's his house where he was born, in Kazan, the Nelson Mandela Museum, the Burns Cottage, and the Bush Family Museum, where, again, so the mixture of values I find interesting. Museums more recently have been used to commemorate trauma and suffering, The one on the left is the Museum of Genocide in Cambodia, and on the right is Robben Island Museum, a very different take on Nelson Mandela's life. The Enlightenment origin of museums can be also left behind, and the challenge to the dominant Western scientific consensus is shown here in this Creation Museum and its explication of creation science. This is in Petersburg, Kentucky. I've never actually been, but it's definitely on my list. So, the stories society tells about itself using museums cover a vast range of of statements. And these stories, not the functions of conservation and scholarship. This is why societies fund museums, to make these powerful statements of group identity. And of course, as these are ideological statements, it's in their nature that they claim not to be political. And that they represent a simple, unmediated reality, or in a word, the truth. And it's interesting to go through those ones and which ones you think are the truth and which ones aren't, because from one perspective, they're all ideological. So I've talked a bit about founders, talked about society, and so on to staff, the people with whom I spent most of my waking hours for the very long period Murray described. As soon as museums began employing staff to carry out these technical functions, the definition of museums, what they're for, shifted from what their purpose was to the work they did. And of course, these are critical functions, but activities are not the same as purposes, and this doesn't tell you what museums are for or why society should pay for them. And one of the characteristic patterns in the long history of museums is that museums are set up for a very strong social purpose or the intention of a founder, and once the staff, a generation later, the staff think that them doing their work is the purpose of museums. And that confusion of functions and purposes pervades the confusion about what museums are for. Underneath the list of tasks is the definition of museums as expressions of a professional identity. Museums assert not just our particular expertise, but the role of experts in general. And some people are very skeptical about the idea of a museum profession. The most extreme rejection of it is a quote from Hal Skramstad, who was the director of the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, which is an amazing place if we ever get to see it. He said, "There's no such thing as the museum profession, and even if there is, nobody cares." Surveys do show that museums are amongst the most trusted public institutions whose knowledge is trusted, but the role of experts has recently been really questioned, and any answer to the question of what museums are for has to be clear about the role of experts in our society, and that's something I'll come back to later. After staff, I want to have a quick look at visitors. If you ask, and there's been a lot of visitor studies, a lot of research on what visitors get out of museum visiting, and you end up with a long list like this of really wide-ranging experiences. One way of summarizing all of these is meaning making, which is a term from both communication theory and anthropology, which captures the fact that museum visits always involve active interpretation by visitors based on their attitudes, personalities, prior knowledge, and life experience. Visitor stories also are about belonging. Visiting museum is saying, I'm part of the group that visits museums. And in lots of places, that means citizenship. It's about being a member of a group that feels at home in the museum, or that in some sense they own it. A very common comment among people who don't visit museums, the excluded people Murray referred to, people who find museums intimidating, is that they're not for the likes of us. And that sense that there's a huge literature on the detail of how you involve people in museums, but the basic distinction is between people who feel welcome and people who don't. And that's the ideological boundary of museums. So, if we put these lists of stories together, the staff, the societal and the visitor, you can see why it's often difficult to say what museums are for. You tend to get people who say one or other of these is the essence of museums, and obviously, or I would think obviously, it's a complex dialogue between these different perspectives. Deep in the DNA of museums, underneath this complex, is a mixture of ideals derived from both the Enlightenment and from Romanticism. And you can see also, given this rich and wide-ranging array of functions, why many people see museums as being crucial to the well-being of human civilization. Underneath all of this is something really valuable that, if we can be clear about, we can perhaps preserve. But before we think about that, I think we need to look at the dark side. Underneath the ideals, and underneath even the sense of wonder which originally inspired museums, is something that can be difficult to sustain in what someone has called our disenchanted age. After the wars and genocide of the past century, we know that every utopia has its shadow, a dark mirror in which its positive traits are revealed to have a negative double, often by judging whole groups of people outside the utopia as inferior or somehow less than human. So celebrating local culture can become an exclusivist definition of citizenships, and many museums that were intended to be instruments of democratic education were used to express the identity of powerful elites. Museums are often captured by elite groups. So the V&A, for example, was incredibly experimental and democratic in its first decade, and it was quickly captured as an elite institution as soon as the founding director, Henry Coles, left. And equally, valuing knowledge can become a form of contempt for the uneducated, and mourning lost ways of life can be a way of judging other forms of life, other ways of life, as inauthentic. So in all of this, museums can easily deceive themselves that they're working on behalf of a universal truth, universal ideals, on behalf of all humanity. Museums historically have tended to be very unreflective institutions, and they rarely consider this meta message, as it were. Then the only way to deal with this is continual self-questioning. Who is missing from the collections, missing from our displays, from our visitors. And that's the only way the positive messages of celebration, what Neil MacGregor called the sunny side, won't be accompanied by messages like these of rejection and humiliation. So, for example, the British Museum, from the very beginning, there were disputes about who was entitled to be there. Access was actually very difficult. To get in, you had to apply in writing on one day and come back the next day and get a ticket. So when they say it was free and open to all, it was free and open to all, to people who had the time and the literacy to do that. But even still, people found this was too much access. So in 1774, one MP suggested that the British Museum should charge on the grounds, and I quote, that the joining of companies is often disagreeable, from persons of different ranks and inclinations being admitted at the same time and obstructing one another. And this is the key question always about museums. Are they for only one kind of person, or are they actually civic spaces that enable the joining of companies and people of different ranks bumping into each another? And actually the British Museum was run like that until 1875. It was only modernised relatively recently. And the only slide about Glasgow, which I obviously could talk about at astonishing length. Murray mentioned the success of Kelvingrove, and these are two of the reviews. The Observer one is obviously very positive. The Burlington magazine said we appeal to the lowest common denominator. It also said very unpleasant things about me and the curatorial staff. But what's interesting about the idea of the lowest common denominator is that's not about me and my professional judgment, which obviously is fair game and very dubious anyway. But the lowest common denominator is a judgment of the people who visit Kelvingrove. it's saying that they're not good enough to be in a museum. They don't have the education or the aesthetic judgment, and they shouldn't be there. And that again is a fundamental issue in any story about visitors. So back to Neil MacGregor and the sunny side of British history. So a fundamental question really is it possible, if museums are about group identity, to develop a critical culture? Can museums really address the difficulty areas of history? Neil says that the Germans have managed to do it, but clearly the Germans were under a bit more pressure than most people to take this on. The British Museum, this is the Enlightenment Gallery in the British Museum, and the appalling new European galleries in the V&A. It's like they hadn't read any critical literature from the past 20 years, but sorry, I'll behave. These institutions have long claimed to represent universal human values, and in lots of ways they did. They represented what were considered universal values at the time. So the British Museum, for example, represented a very clear hierarchy of civilizations from the West through ancient Greece and Rome, through ancient China, Islam, down to primitive societies. And that book, The Races of Man, is a British Museum publication from the 1960s. So Neil claims that the British Museum has always had the aim of showing the world as one, but that isn't actually true. So one of the big issues is, can a museum credibly shift from having one set of values to another without actually radically changing the hierarchy of objects and stories that it tells? And just to give an example of a very famous example of how this has been done, and actually this is usually only done in temporary exhibitions. This is an intervention, sorry about the word, by a great artist called Fred Wilson in the Maryland Historical Society in 1992, so a very long time ago. The precedents are there. So he took the museum category of metalwork, and he showed colonial silver and a slave chain. And he took the cabinet making collection and a slave whipping post, and showed how the museum categories could be used to elucidate or disguise difficult histories. My favorite story, though, of the inherent deep contradictions within museums involve these three people. The one on the left is Franz Boris, one of the great founders of anthropology, and someone who probably did more than anybody else to undermine the theories of scientific racism. The boy in the middle is Minnick, who was an Inuit, who was collected along with 6 others by Admiral Peary in an expedition in 1897. So Minnick came with his father and 4 other adults, and they were studied as living specimens by the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where Boas worked at the time. The adults all succumbed to Western illnesses. They all died of colds and flu. And the museum including Minnick's father, the museum arranged a funeral which was attended by Boas and the curator of the collection, Wallace, who adopted Minnick as his son. In 1906, Minnick learned from his schoolmates about a newspaper article that revealed that his father's bones were in fact on display in the museum. The museum staff had organised a fake funeral with stones in the coffin carried by Wallace and Boas. So they knew that Minnick would have wanted his father buried according to traditional rites. And even when it became public, the museum refused to give the bones back. They eventually went back to the Inuit people, but long after Minnick had died. So the idea of rational science as an ethical process that drives museum behaviour can be culturally really blinkered, and it's easy to be, I suppose, patronising and look back and judge people at the time. The question for us is, what's the equivalent for us that we're doing, where are our blind spots about this? So, the British Museum actually has done some quite good displays about the history of slavery, but in a sense that's an easy, safely historical, distant topic. The British Museum, although, well, some of their partners in the Middle East where they're helping people build museums have big labour issues, but there's a much more difficult general issue, which is the question that Walter Benjamin implies in this statement, written just before he killed himself to escape from the Nazis, is can an institution that is really about celebrating the best of a group identity really address the difficult issues, and can it take a more critical approach to every single object? Every single object has an ambiguous history. So the next chunk, am I doing for time? Am I okay? I've been improvising too much. I'm going a bit over time, sorry. Anyway, list global trends. You could all do your own list, and the huge changes, and there isn't time to say much about almost any of them. But I want to talk a bit about technological transformations and knowledge revolutions. And actually, sorry, that should be growth of museums. One of the big global trends is the growth of museums. The number of museums has doubled in the past 20 years. It's now 55,000. There is one museum in the world for every 130,000 people, which sounds like enough. But actually, despite the global financial problems, the growth isn't slowing down. All over the developing, the second world, as it were, people are opening museums at an astonishing rate. But as well as the technological revolution, there's a knowledge revolution, everything from evolutionary psychology to behavioral economics and neuro everything. And there's a great deal to be learned from these about what museums can be and what they can do. But I'd like to point out two implications of some of this research. The first is the importance of empathy. Since the dawn of humanity, people have known about empathy, but having its existence proved scientifically for lots of people is a breakthrough. The brain has what are called mirror neurons, which are actively designed to mirror the feelings of other people. So empathy is part of our hardwiring. It's not just a liberal cultural invention to make people attack neoliberalism. The other thing that has a neurological foundation that, again, people have known since the dawn of humanity is storytelling. Stories are how human beings interpret the world around us and give meaning to our lives. Stories are particularly important in terms of the difficulties of ambiguous histories. More factual presentations can't capture those ambiguities in the way the stories can, including the stories of museum objects. The digital revolutions are I don't have any pretend to any expertise in these, although I was fascinated by facial profiling, a program that says it can tell how intelligent you are by assessing your face. Imagine the abuses you could have with that. But there's also there's both utopian and dystopian futures. But the one thing I want to point out focus on is the utopian view that the world is flat, that the digital means that place doesn't matter anymore, to crudely summarize Friedman's book. The chart on the right is an engram of the Google engram of the word placemaking, and you can see how it has boomed and strangely declined and boomed again. But whatever the digital change, and location may be less important, but place is more important than ever. The single greatest determinant of somebody's life chances is where they're born. And if you think about whether race, gender, class, actually where you're born reflects all of those hugely. And of course, one of the reasons why the museum boom is happening is because museums can be used to convey a sense of place. I thought I needed to talk about more recent global developments. The recent Brexit and American elections. The way this is reported, it's as if the questioning of expert is very recent and is driven by populism, which is a very unexamined word, obviously amplified by social media. And it's seen as an attack on expertise and neoliberalism by the white working classes and others who are left behind by globalization. What this, for me, means, though, is it's a crisis of knowledge. The examination passing classes are not using their knowledge, according to this perspective, to pursue truth on the Enlightenment, but to serve their own interests and the interests of their children and of their group. So knowledge is coming to be seen as a form of self-interest rather than a form of insight. And actually, the first serious public figure to question the expert wasn't Donald Trump, it was the Queen. When she asked the British Academy, why didn't any of you experts see this coming? And the answer she gave was very similar to the one Alan Greenspan gave to the Senate when they asked him the same question. He said that he knew people would individually, financiers would take risks, but he didn't think anybody would take a risk that threatened the overall system. And what I think may be happening is that the system of knowledge based on expertise and validation by university is under a systemic threat in the same way that the economy was in 2007. And a small piece of evidence of this, in 2008, Gordon Brown suggested that there should be a museum of Britishness. Obviously, there is an aspect in which suggestion of setting up museums reflects real desperation. You only resort to a museum when you can't think of anything else. But actually, it suggests that Gordon Brown knew something was going on, but he was getting so much wrong that nobody believed him. And the response of the museum profession and the educated elite in the press was celebrating Britishness would be a totally un-British thing to do. And it wouldn't be good history, because obviously the British Museum and the National Portrait Gallery do good history, even if they don't do the difficult stuff. So whether it would have been possible to do a British history that was in any way reflective or self-critical, I doubt. But the fact that people in the museum business thought that a Museum of British history wasn't needed reflect that they were just as much out of touch as the politicians and the economists who thought Brexit wouldn't happen. So, to move towards a conclusion, it's clear that museums can be about any subject under the sun. For me, it's clear that they're predominantly statements of identity. And before you get on to doing any of the things I've talked about, working with empathy and storytelling, you have to think about values, because you can experience empathy and still see yourself as rich in human feelings and still exclude people. They are not as human as I am, and therefore my empathy is limited to one group. Stories can be mobilized to deny as well as to affirm the humanity of other groups. So we have to have a clear foundation of values, and the best one, and I think it's really interesting that the attack on human rights is part of what's happening at the moment. Again, it's a systemic threat, not just an individual issue. And I'm particularly interested in the capabilities approach developed by Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, which is much more about how rights are realized in practice rather than technical paper rights that you have a theoretical right to be free. Actually, a right to education is much more important than any theoretical right. And museums, I think, have a huge potential role in this as centres of human development. So, in the future, what can museums be? First, I think museums have to decide whether they're going to be honest, that they are ideological institutions, and then you have to decide whether inequality is our business. Because you have to take sides. Inequality is growing so rapidly that you're either working to oppose it or you're colluding with it getting worse. Being neutral means you're helping it get worse. The next step is we need to decide who the overall message of the museum is addressing. Who do we want to feel is at home in our museums? Do we want museums to be based on citizenship or on the identity of any particular group, in particular educated people? Do we want to project our knowledge, or do we want to tell stories that engage our humanity? Do we actually want to accept the reality of the psychology and the neuroscience that knowledge needs to be co-produced? Or do we want to retain an outdated version of expertise? So for me, this is what a progressive museum would be for in the 21st century. I think that despite their almost inherent contradiction, that we have there's still deep value in the ideals of the Romantic period and of the Enlightenment, even in a disenchanted, post-truth, trumped-up world. Museums can be civic spaces with strong values and inspiring ideals based on human rights and expanding the circle of empathy that Leckie described, nurturing human capabilities. We can tell stories which are rooted in our local place but foster empathy for citizens of the world, and we can work with visitors as co-producers of knowledge and make everyone, no matter what their background, welcome. And for me, museums are rich sources of hope, meaning and social connection, captured by the Australian, Romanian, German philosopher Raymond Gaita when he said, the struggle, what we need to engage in is the struggle to make our institutions reveal rather than obscure, and then enhance rather than diminish the full humanity of our fellow citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this. Mark, we have a roving microphone so you can hear me. I hope you will forgive me. I didn't do my chair's duty very diligently because I was swept away and I didn't really make him stick to time. We have time for a few questions though. That was, I thought really, I would package it and give it to my students doing museology. We have one over here. If you can also say who you are.
Okay. Ian Rutherford from the University of Strathclyde. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I was interested in the discussion about values. You were talking a lot about individual museums. When you deal with multiple museums, say, across the city, do they all manifest the same values, or do you have different kind of emphases in different museums? And how do you, is there kind of discussion about the collection of museums and what they're doing?
That's a difficult question. I know I got
Oh, sorry.
I'm plugged in. All the city's museums, except the Borough, participate in the sort of general Glasgow culture of they're our museums and everybody owns them, and working class visitation. The Borough was set up quite late and is part of the modernist, cool, art is so special you have to chill it down, and which feels unwelcoming to people who are not part of that world. So whether that's a values or a technical thing, it's probably both. But actually the really big, I hate the word challenge, the really difficult problem the team working on refurbishing the Borough at the moment have is can they preserve that amazing aesthetic quality and make it as accessible as Kelvingrove? And they're really going to have to find a different solution. The Kelvingrove or Riverside solution won't work for that. So the values will drive a change.
I can shout, it's all right. I'm just Mrs. Ordinary, and I'm terrified to go into a museum. I think museums are very protectionist. I can go in and look at what they want to show me.
Excuse me, could you wait for the mic, please?
Sure, you can't hear me.
Thank you.
I feel museums are very protectionist. I can't go in off the street and say I would like to look at your collection of, you know, bones from Africa or whatever. They would raise their eyebrows in absolute horror. I think museums protect their collections from the public, and they show you what they want you to see. You've really enlightened my thought process by what you've said today, and now I feel a bit miffed about museums that I can't really access them, and they've got all this wonderful stuff, but they're showing me what they want to show me, you know?
Well, you're right to be suspicious, but you've come to the right place because Well, it'll probably take a year to move everything in, but in about a year's time, all of the university's collection will be here, about a quarter of the city's collection, the rest of it's in a store in Nitzel, and they will be publicly accessible. You won't have to fill in a form, you won't have to justify your interest. You can say, it'll be just much more like the archive, where you can go in and want to say, I want to see the plan for that building, and nobody will ask you why. So and Glasgow again is leading the way in saying, actually the people own this stuff and they have a right to see it without explanation. And Glasgow University, I think in university terms, is really leading the way as well in opening its collection in a civic space. But again, the temptation to go on about that.
Hi, Catherine Steele, University of Glasgow. Lovely paper, but it seemed to be very much you're talking about physical stuff in a physical building. Is that integral to museums?
Well, the official UNESCO definition includes intangible heritage, which I actually find difficult. I mean, I think material stuff is essential to museums. Preserving traditional practices, well, it's a metaphorical use of museums, it's a preservation process. This may reflect the long years of me being acculturated into this system, but there's something particular about material culture that also expresses a particular aspect of human nature and the way we use objects to mediate relationships. So I think museums are about relationships and processes mediated through real objects. I mean, I don't want to sound precious. People can call anything they like a museum, and it can be a museum with no objects. But I think the most interesting kind of museum is the one with real objects and that uses them as a form of insight and mediation. It's from there. I'm happy to shout. No, they're recording it, so you'll be lost to posterity if you do.
Thank you for your paper. Given what you said about current political trends and the nuance of the implication of what I think you were saying, what about the responsibility to people in the future, for the staff of it seemed to me that you were talking about the ways in which staff and others within the institutions were sometimes guilty of shutting out today's population. But what about the responsibility to the future? We're seeing horrific things happening around the world in terms of cultural artifacts being destroyed. Is there a responsibility to protect things for the future?
Absolutely, and to be fair to Neil MacGregor, whom I've given a hard time, the British Museum has been exemplary in engagement with Iraq and with other war-zone countries. I mean, preserving the stuff is the basic task, but preserving the expertise to understand it. But preserving expertise now has to be a much more dynamic process. It's no longer just keeping the archive. It has to be engaged with what I've called a crisis of knowledge. And that means staff are going to have to learn a whole set of new skills, because ultimately society won't go on funding the archive unless the staff are mediating the relationship with the public. You can see them thinking about Prosecco. They've managed all of this without anaesthetic.
I wanted to ask you to join me in thanking Mark ONeill, who really honoured us today with a great talk. And just before we let him loose, we got him a little present to show our appreciation. And as a Greek who ended up back in Glasgow, we think and we hope that he'll have more time to travel, but because as a fellow non-Glaswegian who fell in love with Glasgow, I hope, it's a map of Glasgow from Glasgow University.
I can find my way around. Thank you very much.
This is from Glasgow University in collaboration with National Museums, National Library of Scotland, We thought the third Kelvin Hall partner, you'll have enough presents in a few days in Glasgow Museums and Glasgow Life. And because Mark, I think, after hoping to have more time to go around and travel, but always being prepared, and because this is Glasgow, it's the same map as an umbrella.
Thank you so much. It's bad luck to open it indoors, isn't it? Thank you.
Right, last thing before your Prosecco. Mark mentioned and alluded this great archive and the collaboration, and Mari too. So I'm going to try, so you have the URL there. I don't know if you can read it at all. So the opencollections.org.uk. I think after, especially for the symposium people, a very long day of discussing and thinking and reflecting, you're probably just dying for the Prosecco, but just in case you have a smartphone or an iPad and you want to try this out, this brings together in the digital form the collections of Glasgow museums, the quarter that's going to be stored here. All of the Hunterian collections were dispersed all over in different places, and the moving image archive of the National Library of Scotland. So it's definitely in beta form, very beta. It's just a prototype, but it's the first step of bringing things together in the digital realm and letting people explore and do and ask questions and combine stories in different ways. So if you have the time and your Wi-Fi is working, you can do this maybe while holding your Prosecco. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And for those of the symposium, don't have too much Prosecco. It's 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you all very much.